I remember the waiting room being too warm for a place where people discussed endings. The air felt still, like time didn't know whether to move forward or hold its breath. When I look back, that was the moment everything quietly shifted. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The room itself was ordinary. Soft beige walls, framed certificates, a slow ceiling fan that only pretended to cool the air. There was a faint scent of coffee someone had brewed hours ago and forgotten about. My children sat across from me. Daniel to my left, Claire to my right. Both on their phones, shoulders tense, faces composed in the way people try to look when they believe they're being watched. They spoke softly to each other, but never to me, as if I were a piece of furniture that had always been in the room and would always remain silent. I folded my hands in my lap. I've always had steady hands, even now. That morning, I watched their faces with a kind of distant curiosity. They were kind in presentation, gentle smiles, concerned nods, but there was a sharpness behind their eyes, a calculation. I had begun to see it only recently, the way people do when something finally clicks into place after being ignored for far too long. Claire kept checking the wall clock, not because she was anxious about me, but because she had somewhere else she wanted to be. Daniel was rehearsing confidence, the kind you use when you believe things are already guaranteed. He straightened his tie 3 times. He smiled to himself twice. I didn't miss any of it. Age sharpens perception in ways youth doesn't understand. Then the door opened, and Emily stepped inside. She didn't rush. She didn't announce herself. She simply entered and gave me a small, tired smile. The kind of smile you give to someone you've stayed up nights worrying about. She sat beside me without asking if the seat was taken. I felt my breathing ease the moment she did. Emily wasn't my child by blood. She was my late wife's niece. But she had been the only one who stayed when I came home from the hospital. The only one who brewed tea at midnight when pain made sleep impossible. The only one who didn't look at me like I was a countdown clock. She placed her hand over mine, just for a moment. It said everything words couldn't. I noticed Daniel glance at her, not with recognition of her effort, but with irritation. He didn't like unexpected variables. Claire simply pretended not to see her at all. Mr. Alden Price, my attorney, called my name from the office doorway. I stood slowly. Emily rose with me. My children hesitated, just slightly, as if unsure whether she belonged in the room where decisions were made. But they said nothing. Their silence was not acceptance, only strategy. The 4 of us walked in together. The lawyer's office was dimly lit. Soft lamp glow instead of overhead fluorescent light. It smelled faintly of leather and polished wood. A long oak table stretched across the room, and we took our seats around it. This was the quiet, practical, unremarkable to anyone else. I reached for the sign-in sheet on the table and wrote my name in slow, clear script. Michael Harris, date, purpose, estate consultation. The pen didn't tremble, not because I was certain, but because I had already made peace with the uncertainty. As we settled, I could feel a shift in the room, subtle, nearly invisible. Daniel leaned forward, ready to guide the conversation. Claire crossed her legs, the kind of posture meant to signal grace. Emily simply rested her hands on the table, waiting, the way people do when they have nothing to prove. Mr. Price began with the basics: terms, percentages, property, accounts, the kind of language that drains warmth from a room if there wasn't much warmth to begin with. My children nodded along eagerly, and that's when I realized something I had been avoiding for months. They weren't listening to me. They were listening for what they believed they deserved. No one else would have heard it. But I did. The subtle hunger, the expectation. I didn't say anything. Not yet. There would be time for truth, time for consequences, time for decisions they never saw coming, because this meeting wasn't just about division, it was about revelation and The envelope containing that revelation had not been opened. Yet, the room was still, warm, quiet, like the breath before a storm. I didn't think I would wake up after that surgery. I remember the cold brightness of the recovery room, the steady beeping, the feeling of drifting somewhere between this world and the next. When I finally opened my eyes, the first face I saw wasn't Daniel's or Claire's. It was Emily's. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and something metallic, like air that had been scrubbed too clean. I had been in the cardiac wing. White walls, blue curtains, machines breathing on my behalf. I couldn't speak at first. My throat felt tight, dry, raw. But Emily didn't need me to speak. She just took my hand and said very quietly, "You're all right. I'm here. Time in hospitals is slow. It stretches and curls back on itself." The days felt long and heavy, broken only by the routine of nurses checking vitals, adjusting pillows, marking charts. But the nights, that's when the loneliness seeped in. The kind that makes you think about all the chances you wasted, all the love you didn't say out loud, all the ways you should have done better. Emily stayed every night. She set her jacket over the hard visitor chair, curled up as best she could, and dozed lightly, waking every time I shifted or winced, not because she was obligated, not because she wanted anything, but because she knew grief, and she recognized the look of someone who didn't want to face death alone. During the day, my children came. They brought flowers, balloons, cards signed with cheerful phrases. "Get well soon. We love you." The kind of love that photographs well. They smiled, hugged me, took pictures for social media, kissed my forehead, and left before dinner every time. They were always late, always in a hurry, always apologizing for calls they just had to take. Nurses notice everything. They see the private truth behind every family performance. One evening, a nurse leaned in while checking my monitors. Her voice was soft, matter-of-fact, without judgment. "She's been here every night." "That's rare," she whispered, nodding toward Emily, asleep upright in the chair. I nodded. I knew. There was a quiet moment where I wondered, had I failed as a father? Or had time simply revealed the truth? Daniel visited the third day only to ask about insurance details. Claire spent her visit scrolling through online boutiques, occasionally glancing up to tell me I looked stronger every time she came. But Emily brought soup in a thermos that smelled like home. She spread a blanket over my lap on the nights when the hospital air felt too cold. She read aloud from a book I used to read to her when she was younger, something I didn't even remember doing until she reminded me gently, page by page. There was a morning I woke before sunrise. The room was quiet, washed in soft gray light. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady and small. Emily was asleep again, her head resting against the chair, her hair falling loose around her face. I just watched her for a while, and I realized something that felt both heavy and relieving. Family is proven, not declared. A few days before I was discharged, Daniel and Claire arrived together. They were cheerful, bright, loud. They suggested, very gently, that I consider moving into a care facility. "For your safety," they said. "So you won't be a burden, so we can focus on our own families too." They smiled while saying it. They genuinely thought it was kindness. Emily didn't speak. She didn't argue. She just placed her hand on my shoulder to steady me while I breathed through the weight of that moment. It came when the nurse brought the visitor log clipboard for daily verification. I signed my name shakily. Under the column marked Overnight Care Companion, the nurse wrote Emily's name, again, dated and time-stamped. Not Daniel. Not Claire. Not once. Just Emily. Every night. When I left the hospital, Daniel and Claire walked me to the car while discussing property taxes and future planning. Emily walked beside me in silence, holding my arm so I didn't slip on the curb. That was when I realized some people love you when loving you is convenient. Others love you when love is work. I didn't say anything out loud that day, but the decision began there. Quiet, deep, final. And like most turning points in life, it came with no dramatic music. Just clarity. The first version of my will was simple. I wrote it at a time when I still believed love naturally translated into loyalty. When I look back now, I see how naive that was. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. Mr. Alden Price's office looked different the first time I sat down to discuss the will. The air felt lighter. The stakes felt distant. My health was steady then. My steps were strong. And my children still hugged me without hesitation. I remember sitting across from Mr. Price, watching him adjust his glasses while reviewing documents. He had a quiet, practiced way of speaking. The tone of someone who has spent a lifetime navigating the fragility of families. "So," he began, tapping his pen lightly against the desk, "you'd like an equal division? Standard 50-50 split?" "Yes," I said easily, without hesitation. "It's fair." Mr. Price didn't challenge me. He didn't argue. He simply looked up and studied me, the way a doctor looks at a patient who says they're fine when the chart says otherwise. "Fair," he repeated. "Yes, on paper perhaps." I remember frowning, unsure what he meant. He continued, voice steady and quiet. "Mr. Harris, I don't give advice on emotional matters. But I will tell you what I've learned from experience. Inheritance does not create conflict. It only reveals it. At the time, the meaning didn't land. I thought my children cared for me. Genuinely, deeply. I believed time and shared memories were stronger than resentment or self-interest. I believed we were bound by something unbreakable. So I nodded, and we drafted the will. Property divided evenly. Account balances split. Personal belongings allocated thoughtfully. Nothing dramatic. Nothing heavy. When I left that day, the sun was bright outside. I remember feeling content, certain I had acted wisely. Emily drove me home, though I was perfectly capable of driving myself. She didn't insist. She simply offered. And I accepted because her presence was comforting in a way I didn't have words for then. On the drive back, the radio played softly. Emily didn't speak much. She rarely did unless there was something worth saying. I've always admired that about her. Half the world fills silence because they fear it. She let silence breathe. As we pulled into the driveway, she asked, "Are you sure they'll understand this? The decisions you're making?" I smiled, a bit amused. "There's nothing to understand," I said. "It's equal. No one can be upset about fairness." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. There was a sadness in her eyes. Not disagreement, but awareness. She had seen parts of my family I had chosen not to see. A week later, Claire called, not to ask how I was, not to reminisce or check on me. No, she wanted to know about the contents of the appointment. How did it go? What did you decide? Are things straightforward? Her voice was light, friendly, but the tone underneath was sharp. Careful. Daniel asked too, though his approach was different. "So, Dad, did you make sure everything is legally tight? You know how complications can happen." Complications meaning, make sure nothing prevents me from getting what I expect. I ignored the undertones. I told myself I was imagining things. Because love does that. It bends uncomfortable truths until they stop hurting. The Ver. A week after drafting the will, a courier delivered the unsigned copy to my home. Cream-colored envelope. Thick paper, ink that smelled faintly of permanence. I set it on the dining table, intending to sign it the next morning. But when I sat down to do so, my hand hesitated. Not because I doubted the fairness, but because there was a quiet tug in my chest, a whisper. Wait. Watch a little longer. I placed the will in a folder and slid it into the desk drawer. I told myself it was temporary, but something had already begun shifting. Not in the world around me, not in my children's behavior that had been shifting for years. I just hadn't seen it. What changed was my willingness to see. In the weeks that followed, I started paying attention to tone, to timing, to what was said and what was never said. Fairness, I realized, was not always just, and love. Love was not always love. I didn't sign the will. Not yet, because some truths reveal themselves only when we stop looking away. I thought drafting my will would be a formality, a responsible thing to do. I assumed it would be quick, clean, uncomplicated. But the moment I sat down in that leather chair across from my attorney, something in the air felt heavier than I expected. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick volumes no one reads unless they have to. A single window let in muted daylight, the kind that looks tired. Mr. Alden Price sat behind his desk, hands folded, expression unreadable in the way only seasoned attorneys manage. I had known him for years. He helped with small matters, property titles, insurance filings, but this was different. This was legacy. He began with the tone professionals use when they are trained to remove emotion from sentences. "We'll start with the basics," he said. "Assets, property, distribution preferences," I nodded. I already had an answer, an easy one. "Everything split evenly between Daniel and Claire," I said. 50-50. He didn't write it down. He just studied me for a moment, not unkindly, but with awareness. I didn't understand then what he was quietly assessing. "I do now." "That's standard," he finally said. "And simple. But I need to ask, is that what you want? Or is that what feels correct on paper?" I almost laughed. "What's the difference?" Mr. Price leaned back in his chair slightly, fingers resting on the corner of a yellow legal pad. "Inheritance doesn't create conflict," he said. "It reveals it." The words sat in the room like a weight. I didn't know what to do with them at the time. I had always believed I raised my children well, with care, stability, opportunity. We shared holidays, vacations, birthdays. Yes, there had been distance in recent years, but I attributed that to adulthood. Busy schedules, life moving quickly, so I smiled. Not defensive, just certain. "Yes," I said. "Equal is right. Equal is fair." He didn't argue. He just wrote it down, neat and clean. We spent the next hour reviewing accounts, home valuation, retirement savings, personal effects, photographs, heirlooms, things that held memory value more than monetary worth. The conversation was methodical, professional, no sentiment, no storytelling, just numbers and instructions. But somewhere in the middle of the meeting, something flickered in my mind. A moment in the hospital. Emily's hand resting over mine, her voice, her quiet loyalty, her presence. And then, just as quickly, the image faded beneath the habit of old beliefs. My children love me. They will be grateful. They will honor this. When I left the office, the day was bright, almost too bright. The kind of day that makes you squint, even when the sky is clear. I felt good, accomplished, responsible. I believed I had secured peace. Emily drove me home, not because I needed help, but because she didn't like the thought of me sitting in a waiting room alone. She didn't ask what was in the will. She didn't even bring it up. She just asked, "Do you want to stop for tea before we go back?" We sat at a small cafe near the park. The windows were open. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and something sweet, like fresh pastry. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There are some people whose presence is enough. But there was a moment, small, barely noticeable, when I caught her watching me with a look I couldn't identify then. Not expectation, not curiosity, something softer, something like concern. "Everything okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I thought so." The next morning, a courier delivered the draft will in a sealed envelope. Heavy paper, embossed letterhead, sharp black ink. I sat at the dining table alone, unfolded it carefully, smoothed the pages with my palm. My signature line was empty. I picked up the pen, and my hand stopped, not shaking, not uncertain, just paused. For the first time, I wondered if equal was the same as fair. That was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for. Yet, a shifting, a quiet one. The kind that starts like a whisper in a locked room. I placed the unsigned will in the desk drawer, not because I changed my mind, but because something inside me had finally begun to open its eyes. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, subtle, quiet, sometimes invisible to everyone but you. I learned that after my wife passed, and I learned it again in the months that followed. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. There is a small garden behind my house. Nothing extravagant, just a patch of rose bushes, a few lavender shrubs, and the oak tree my wife planted the year Daniel was born. She used to spend mornings out there, pruning, watering, humming softly under her breath. Even when illness had stolen most of her strength, she insisted on tending to it. "Living things need to be reminded they're wanted," she'd say. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to step outside for weeks. The garden felt like a room she hadn't finished leaving yet. Every petal, every leaf looked like a memory I wasn't ready to face. But Emily gently changed that. One afternoon, months after the surgery, she suggested we take a walk. Nothing forced, nothing heavy. Just air, just movement. She waited until I nodded before leading me outside, patient, unhurried. The sunlight felt softer than I remembered. The breeze carried a faint, sweet scent of rosemary. The birds were loud enough to fill the silence without demanding anything from me. We sat on the old wooden bench by the oak tree. Its paint was chipped, the wood worn smooth by time and hands and weather. I traced one of the grooves in the armrest with my thumb, remembering how my wife used to lean her head on my shoulder right here. During evenings when the world felt simple. "I miss her too," Emily said, so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. I looked at her. Really looked. Her eyes weren't red. She wasn't crying. But her voice held that heaviness of someone who has been holding grief in the same room, just from a different angle. I realized then that she hadn't just been helping me survive the loss. She had been grieving beside me. My children never talked about their mother anymore. They sent flowers on holidays. They posted photos on anniversaries. But grief, to them, was something to acknowledge and quickly move past. Efficiency disguised as strength. Emily treated grief like a room with a door that stays open. We talked for a while. Not about deep things. Not yet. Just comfortable small memories. The way my wife used to tuck her hair behind her ear. The way she laughed without covering her mouth. The way she knew the exact moment someone needed silence instead of words. At some point, Emily stood and walked to the garden bed. She knelt and began trimming the dead stems from the roses with a small pair of shears she had brought from her apartment. She worked slowly, carefully. She didn't talk as she did it. She didn't perform the gesture. She did it with the intimacy of someone returning care to something that had once given her comfort. When she finished, she stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I'll come by tomorrow," she said. I don't know what made her add it. Maybe she saw something in my face. Maybe she knew I was afraid of the silence returning once she left. She walked inside to get her bag. I remained on the bench. The garden felt alive again, not restored, not healed, but breathing. When I followed her inside, I found something on the kitchen table, a small handwritten note, torn neatly from a notepad. ink slightly smudged, as if written quickly and sincerely. "You're not alone. No name, no flourish. Just that." I don't know how long I stood there holding it. I folded it once, carefully, and placed it in the drawer of my bedside table. Not because I thought I would forget its message, but because some words deserved to be kept close. My children called that evening, not to ask how I was, not to see if I needed company. They wanted to discuss property valuations and long-term planning. Their voices sounded distant, like they were speaking from another room, another life. I answered politely. I listened. I said nothing they didn't want to hear, but I was different now. Something had rooted itself inside me, something subtle but steady. Not anger, not judgment, just clarity. Emily returned the next day, and the day after, and slowly, day by day, I realized that love is not measured by blood, but by presence, and presence is unmistakable once you start paying attention. People assume change happens slowly, gradually, gently, but in my experience, real change arrives suddenly, in a single sentence, a tone, a look that cannot be taken back. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed the shift, the kind of day that doesn't stand out in memory. Mild weather, soft light coming through the living room curtains. Nothing special happening. Emily had just left after bringing lunch. She always made enough for both of us, always set the extra portion aside in glass containers so I wouldn't have to cook later. No announcement, no praise, just quiet care. She closed the front door, and for a few minutes, the house felt full. The way a house feels when someone has filled it with warmth simply by being present. Then the doorbell rang again. Daniel stood outside, hands in his pockets, wearing that business-casual confidence he always carried. He hugged me quickly when he came in. A polite hug, a safe hug. The kind of hug that ends before either person feels anything. "Thought I'd check in," he said. "Make sure you're doing all right." We sat in the living room. And for the first time, I noticed that Daniel didn't look at me while speaking. He looked around, at the framed photographs, at the shelves, at the piano, at the antique clock above the fireplace. Not with sentiment, but with evaluation. He was measuring the room. "So," he said lightly, "I've been thinking. This house, it's a lot for you to manage on your own. The yard, the upkeep, must be overwhelming." He phrased it as concern. His tone was soft, his posture relaxed, but he didn't ask how I was managing. He assumed I couldn't. "I'm doing all right," I said. Daniel smiled, not a warm smile, but the kind you give when you think someone is failing to understand something obvious. Sure. I just mean we should start talking about the future. You know, planning. For your sake. So, you're comfortable." He said, comfortable the way some people say, controlled. Before I could respond, the front door opened again. Claire, entering without knocking. She breezed in with her sunglasses still on, kissed my cheek, and took a seat on the arm of a chair, as if she were visiting a set instead of a home. "You look good," she said. "Better. That's great." Her tone was breezy, but her eyes were sharp. She also scanned the room. Inventory. Not memory. "We were actually just talking," Daniel continued, now speaking to her instead of me, about how Dad might want to start thinking about something smaller, something easier, something liquid was the word he didn't say. Claire nodded thoughtfully, as though she had considered this deeply, but I recognized her expression too. It was the same expression she used when browsing online catalogs. She crossed her legs. "It would make sense, especially if, well, at some point you need more care." They said it like a hypothetical, but they were planning as if it were imminent. Before the surgery, before the hospital, before the garden. I might have agreed. I might have believed they were looking out for me. I might have ignored the undercurrent. But now I saw what was happening. They were preparing for my absence before I was even done living. And Emily, she was preparing for my life. Daniel reached into his coat and placed a glossy real estate brochure on the coffee table. A picture of a condo complex. Modern, small, efficient. "This one's close to us," he said. "It would make visits easier." Visits? The word sounded like a scheduled obligation, not family. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at both of them. Really looked. These were my children, my blood, my history, and yet they felt like strangers rehearsing a scene they'd already performed in their heads. Something inside me settled then. Not anger, not disappointment, just certainty. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I'll think about it." They smiled, satisfied. They believed they had planted a seed, but the ground had already shifted, because the moment they left, the house felt empty. Not of them, but of care. Emily returned the next morning with a grocery bag in one hand and a small pair of gardening shears in the other. She noticed the brochure on the table but didn't touch it, didn't comment, didn't pry. She just asked, "Tea or coffee?" Her presence didn't demand anything, and in that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to face. Love is shown in who stays, entitlement is shown in who waits. There are phone calls you forget before you've even set the receiver down. And then there are the calls that split your life into a before and an after. This one was the latter. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from, or what time it is. It happened early in the morning. The kind of morning where the light is just beginning to soften the edges of furniture. I had just finished my medication routine, slow, deliberate movements, when the landline rang. The sound felt too loud in the quiet house, I answered, and it was my doctor. His voice was warm but clinical, practiced in delivering news gently. He explained that although my surgery had been successful, recovery would be longer than expected. My body needed rest, care, consistency. "No exertion," he emphasized. "Your heart needs time to trust itself again." I promised to follow his instructions, not out of fear, but because I had learned the cost of ignoring limits. I hung up the phone and sat down at the kitchen table. The morning sun was stretching across the floor in slow, golden shapes. For a moment, I just breathed quietly. I didn't think of the past or the future, just breath. Just now, then my phone buzzed. This time, a text. "Daniel, heard you spoke with the doctor. We should discuss next steps." There was no, "How are you feeling?" No, "Do you need anything?" Just next steps. As though I were a project needing logistical oversight. Before I could reply, the front door opened and Emily stepped inside. She carried a small grocery bag, bread, honey, and soup. She didn't know about the call yet, but she could read rooms the way some people read headlines. "You're quiet," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "What did the doctor say?" I told her, slowly. She listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, without trying to rearrange my reality into something more convenient. She simply nodded and moved around the kitchen, familiar with where everything was, washing her hands before preparing breakfast. It was seamless, comfortable, safe. Halfway through cooking, the doorbell rang. Daniel. He came in quickly, his steps too loud for a house still waking up. He greeted Emily with a polite nod. Polite in the way people are when they don't know where another person fits in their plans. Then he turned to me. "We need to talk," he said. We sat at the kitchen table. Emily stayed by the stove, not inserting herself, but not leaving either. She understood presence better than anyone I'd known. Daniel clasped his hands in front of him, leaning in slightly. "I think we should start looking into professional care," he said. "In-home nursing, maybe." His tone was smooth, controlled. "It's for your safety. We don't want something to happen while no one's here." It sounded reasonable. until you listened to the subtext. You shouldn't be living independently anymore. Your life needs supervision. We want to manage your circumstances. I nodded slowly. And who would manage the nurses? I asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. Claire and I. Obviously. Obviously. Emily turned off the stove, moving quietly. She didn't look at either of us. She didn't need to. The tension was a presence of its own. I thought of the hospital. Nights, the soft chair, the blanket tucked around me, the hand holding mine while monitors beeped, the steady breathing of someone who refused to leave. I looked at Daniel. His suit was pressed, his watch expensive, his face composed. He wasn't malicious. He was simply confident that care and affection could be outsourced. The doctor had emailed a recovery instruction sheet, printed in clean black text. Primary caregiver acknowledgement required. A signature line. I slid it gently toward Emily. She froze. Not from fear, but from the weight of meaning. She signed her name slowly. Daniel's expression faltered. Only for a moment. But I saw it. That was the shift. Not in the room, not in the world. In Tithio and me, he tried to recover. We just want what's best, he insisted. And I believed that he believed that. But belief and love are not the same thing. Love shows up. Love stays. Love doesn't need to manage anything to feel secure. Daniel left soon after. Claire texted later, asking if arrangements had been made yet. Emily and I ate breakfast together in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that gently wraps around a room. When she left, the house didn't feel empty. When my children left, it always did. That was the truth I could no longer unsee. I used to think distance was measured in miles, but I learned it's measured in tone, in pauses, in the quiet spaces where care should live. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. After the conversation with Daniel, the house settled into a strange calm. Not peaceful, just quiet in a way that felt observant, like the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. I went about my routine, morning tea, short walk to the mailbox, slow breathing exercises the doctor recommended. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt the same. My phone stayed silent for 2 days. Then, suddenly, messages began arriving all at once, from both Daniel and Claire. Not phone calls, not voice, words without presence. Claire, just thinking of you. How are you feeling? Daniel, let us know if you need anything. Seriously, the softness felt selective, not warm, not full, just strategic. Still, I replied politely, I was not looking for a fight. I only wanted to understand what was beginning to form beneath the surface. Emily continued to visit. She brought groceries, walked with me in the garden, helped reorganize medications when the dosages needed adjustment. She made sure I drank enough water. She asked how I was sleeping. She washed dishes without being asked. She made conversation when talking helped, and she left silence when silence helped more. She didn't perform care. She simply cared. I noticed how natural it felt to talk to her. Not about heavy things, but about small things. The weather, the color of the sky that morning, a memory of my wife watering roses barefoot in the early sunlight. Emily always listened, even when the memory had more breath than words. Sometimes she'd laugh softly, or place her hand over mine for just a moment. Gentle, human. One afternoon, while Emily was sweeping dried leaves from the porch, Claire pulled into the driveway. She stepped out of her car in heels too thin for the gravel and waved at me through a practiced smile. "Dad! I thought I'd surprise you." Emily straightened but didn't speak. She was careful that way, always giving others room to reveal themselves. Claire hugged me, quick and light, before stepping back and surveying the porch like she was assessing the before photo of a renovation project. "You look better," she said. "See? Rest is helping." She said it like I was supposed to congratulate her for being correct. We sat in the living room. Emily went into the kitchen to make tea without being asked. Claire folded one leg over the other. Her voice was breezy, practiced, polished. "So, Daniel mentioned you two talked about care plans. I think that's really good. I know it's hard to adjust to needing help." She said, needing help the way someone might say, being replaced? I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. Emily returned with tea, setting a cup in front of Claire with a kindness that Claire didn't even notice. Claire took one sip and set it down like it was an accessory rather than something warm offered by another person. She leaned forward slightly. "I just want us to plan things right," she said. "So things are smooth later. You know, the future. The future." She never said your future. Only as if I were already gone from it. Emily sat quietly beside me, present, steady, unshaken. I used to believe silence was emptiness, but now I understood silence could also be witness. Later that evening, after Claire left, I opened my notebook, the one I'd begun keeping after the surgery, and wrote, Day 17. Emily visited, 4 hours. Helped with meds, porch, tea. Day 17. Claire visited, 36 minutes. Topic: housing, planning. The numbers looked cold on the page, but numbers don't lie. The next week followed the same rhythm. Calls from my children were short, efficient, emotional only, where sentiment strengthened persuasion. Their words had weight, yes, but the weight of expectation, not affection. Emily's presence was light, but the lightness of something that holds steady rather than pressing down. One night, after she left, I sat in the quiet house and realized something I had avoided acknowledging. Sati did not feel missed when my children weren't here, but I felt absent when Emily wasn't. That was the first truth. The second came just as quietly. If love is real, it doesn't need reminder. If love is performance, it requires reassurance. I closed the notebook. Slowly, the distance between us had already begun. Not in a dramatic argument, not in a slammed door, not in a declaration, just in the smallest of choices, repeated. That's how families, separate, quietly. There are conversations that don't feel important while they're happening, and yet, when you look back, you realize they were the moment your life quietly shifted course. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. A few weeks had passed since the morning Daniel tried to talk about next steps. Life settled into something steady. Emily was still visiting regularly, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just long enough to water the garden and check my medications. She never asked for anything in return. Her care had no hooks, no expectations, no invisible ledger being balanced. My children, though, their tone had changed, not dramatically, not cruelly, just enough to be noticed. A little too warm, a little too careful, a little too interested in plans, rather than days, and I felt it. The distance between us widening, even as their words pretended to pull us closer. I didn't intend to talk to Mr. Price again. Not so soon, but one morning I received a letter from his office, a reminder that the draft will was still unsigned. No pressure, the note said, simply following up in case revisions are needed. Logical, polite. I scheduled an appointment. The office felt the same as before, quiet, measured, smelling faintly of old paper and lemon polish. The room didn't feel heavy yet, but I did. Mr. Price greeted me with a small nod. He didn't launch into legal language. He didn't hurry. He simply sat, waited, and allowed silence to clear the room before speaking. "How have things been?" he asked. It was a simple question, but he asked it the way doctors ask questions about pain. Not the pain you report, but the pain you live with. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't describe Daniel's careful tone, or Claire's quick visits, or the way they both seemed to be looking at life as if I were already stepping out of it. Instead, I spoke in soft pieces, subtle shifts, small observations, long pauses between sentences, and he listened, not just to the words, but to the spaces in between. When I finished, he leaned back and took a breath. "I see this more often than you might imagine," he said. "When someone reaches a point of vulnerability, people around them reveal what matters most to them. Sometimes that's love. Sometimes it's something else. I knew what the something else was. I just didn't want to say it out loud," he continued, speaking slowly, as though choosing each word with precision. "A will can divide assets," he said, "but it can also tell the truth about a life. If you want to, you can add an addendum, something private, something only to be read at the time of the will's execution." I looked at him, unsure. "A secret page?" "Not secret," he corrected gently. "Just separate. A letter, a statement, a clarification. It doesn't change the structure of the will unless you want it to, but it gives context, truth, final clarity." He was giving me a choice. To speak now, or to speak when I was no longer here to defend my voice. Sitretihu, thought sat in my chest, like a small stone dropped into deep water. Emily had shown up, my children had visited, both. Statements were true, but only one was love. I sat quietly for a long time. Finally, I nodded. "Yes," I said. "Let's draft something. Not final, just something." He didn't smile. He didn't congratulate me. He just opened a fresh document and wrote the date at the top of the page, leaving space below for the words I had not yet found. He wrote, "Addendum, to be read upon execution." And beneath it, a single blank line waiting for truth. When I left the office, the air outside felt different, sharper, clearer. Emily was waiting in the car. She had insisted on driving me. Not because I couldn't drive, but because the doctor had advised against stress. She asked how the meeting went, but not in a probing way. Her voice held curiosity, not expectation. I didn't tell her about the addendum, not because it was a secret, but because it carried weight, and I wasn't ready to place that weight in someone else's hands. We drove home in silence, not uncomfortable, not heavy, just real. As we pulled into the driveway, the wind moved through the garden, rustling the lavender and bending the roses gently, like someone whispering something only the flowers needed to hear. I realized then this story was already unfolding, not through decisions made loudly, but through the quiet shifts I could no longer ignore. Something was beginning, and something else was ending. I didn't plan for that evening to become a turning point. It was supposed to be just dinner, a simple meal, familiar table, familiar faces. But sometimes truth doesn't ask for permission. It just enters the room. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. Daniel was the one who suggested we all eat together. Family dinner, he said, as though the phrase itself could rebuild what was already shifting beneath us. Claire offered to bring dessert. Emily came because I asked her to, not as a guest, but as someone who had been part of the day-to-day fabric of my life. The dining room felt smaller than usual. The overhead light was warm but unforgiving. It illuminated everything, even the things we weren't ready to notice. The table was set neatly. Plates, silverware, a pot roast Emily had helped prepare because she knew I tired easily. The food smelled familiar, safe even, but the air was off, too careful, too polite. Daniel spoke about his work first. Long corporate sentences full of accomplishments and optimistic projections. Claire nodded enthusiastically, but kept glancing toward my face, watching, measuring, waiting for reactions she could use. Emily ate quietly. She always let others finish. She had that way of making space. Something rare, something quiet, something soft but strong. Then it happened. Daniel cleared his throat the way people do when they're about to shift from casual to purpose. "So, Dad," he said, setting his fork down carefully, "we've been thinking. This house is really a lot for you to handle alone. It's time to start planning something more manageable, for your comfort." There it was again. That word, comfortable. The polite disguise for control. Claire followed immediately. Rehearsed tone, smooth as polished glass. "We want to make sure everything is set up properly. The finances, the estate, long-term arrangements, so there aren't any complications later." She said later as if it were a place she was already living in. Emily looked down at her plate. Not surprised, just sad. I took a slow breath. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Crisp. Freshly printed. Too clean to be casual. He slid the paper across the table. A cost. Breakdown. Projected sale value of the house. Care facility. Options. Maintenance. Fees. Future liquidation estimates. Numbers. Where memories should have been. I looked at the page. Not long. Just long enough to understand. Claire leaned forward, voice soft. "We just want you to have security. We're thinking of you." Emily's hand tightened around her fork, the smallest movement, but full of meaning. Security. My wife planted the oak tree outside with her own hands. Emily had sat beside me at the hospital, her head resting on the uncomfortable chair arm. My children had brought brochures. I set the paper down gently. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "The night I came home from surgery?" Daniel blinked. "We visited. You stopped by," I corrected. "Briefly. Do you remember who stayed that night? The whole night?" Silence. Real silence. Not polite, not strategic, not waiting. Claire's eyes flicked toward Emily. A quick, sharp glance. The kind someone gives when they recognize a truth they were hoping would stay quiet. Emily didn't speak. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. The truth was already in the room. Daniel recovered first. "We didn't know you needed us to stay." "You didn't ask," I said. The sentence landed softly. But it landed. The conversation dissolved after that. Not into shouting, but into avoidance. Small talk, forced smiles, the kind of conversation people have when they are suddenly aware of the distance between who they think they are and what they've shown. When dessert was finished, Claire stood. "We should go," she said. "Big day tomorrow, yes, always a big day. Somewhere else." They hugged me with arms that touched but didn't hold. They thanked Emily for dinner, but their gratitude never reached their eyes. The front door closed behind them. The house exhaled. Emily began clearing the table. I reached out and touched her wrist. Light, but enough to stop her. "Sit," I said. We sat together in the quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock. "You handled that," she said softly. I shook my head. "I just saw it." She nodded, because she knew I was finally seeing clearly. That night, I didn't sleep much, not from sorrow, not from fear, but from recognition. Families break slowly, and then all at once. I used to think the hardest part of growing older was the body changing, the aches, the limits, the slower mornings. But I was wrong. The hardest part is seeing the truth of people you love. Clearly. Finally, without excuses to soften it. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The night after the dinner stayed with me. The silence in the house felt different. Not empty, just honest. There was no more pretending that everything was the same. Something had shifted, and it wasn't going to shift back. I moved slowly the next morning, not from pain, but from reflection. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the garden through the window. The oak tree stood there, solid, rooted, growing even when seasons tried to strip it bare. I used to think I was like that. I wasn't sure anymore. Emily arrived just before noon. She let herself in, as she always did now. Not out of assumption, but because I'd told her many times she didn't need to knock. She placed a bag of groceries on the counter and began putting things away. No questions, no probing. She gave space. Finally, I spoke. "They want to sell the house," I said. Emily didn't turn around right away. She continued placing items in the pantry, one by one, as if the moment needed time to breathe before being responded to. "No," she said quietly. "She didn't say I'm sorry. She didn't say they're wrong. She didn't say you deserve better. She simply acknowledged the truth, and sometimes acknowledgement is the deepest form of care. I told her about the dinner, the brochure, the cost breakdown, the word comfort used like a leash. She listened with steady breaths. Her presence didn't fill the room. It steadied it. "You're allowed to want your life," she finally said. "Even now, especially now." The words settled into me. Not sharp, not cutting, just firm. A reminder that living was still happening, that I wasn't done. Later that afternoon, after Emily left, I walked through the house, room by room, slower than usual. I touched the dining table where we'd eaten countless meals. I paused by the piano my wife used to play when the evenings were too quiet. I stood in the hallway, where framed photographs traced decades of birthdays, graduations, holidays, laughter. These walls held life, not just ownership, and then I went to my bedroom. I opened the top drawer of my bedside table, and there it was, the note Emily had left weeks before. "You're not alone." 4 words. Complicated, true. Sat on the edge of the bed holding that slip of paper, and a realization rose in me like slow dawn. It wasn't about property, or independence, or pride. It was about love. Who had given it? Who had only borrowed the word? And suddenly, the decision I had been circling for weeks no longer felt difficult. It felt necessary. I took out a clean sheet of stationery, the kind my wife used for thank you notes, and I began to write. Not the full addendum. Not yet. Just one paragraph. A paragraph about presence, about care, about who stayed. My handwriting was steady. When I finished, I folded the paper carefully and placed it in an envelope. I didn't seal it, but I held it, felt its weight, understood its meaning. The sun was setting by then. The house was washed in warm gold. The world felt quiet. Not empty, just quiet. Later that evening, Daniel called. His voice was cheerful. Too cheerful. "Hey, Dad, want to check in about that housing conversation? Claire and I think we found some really good options." Options, not questions, not choices. Decisions already imagined, without me. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself. I did not justify the life I was still living. When he finished, I said only, "I'll take it from here." He paused. "From what?" he asked. "My life," I said. There was silence on the line. A long one. "We're just trying to help," he replied. But even he didn't sound convinced. "I know," I said. "I see that now." The call ended quietly. I placed the envelope beside my bed. Not out of anger. Not out of bitterness. but out of clarity. Something inside me had settled. And once something settles, it does not return to how it was. This was the beginning of the choice that would change everything. Not revenge, not punishment, just truth. Most people think betrayal arrives in shouting, slammed doors, harsh words. But real betrayal is quiet. It comes dressed as concern. It sounds like care. It pretends to protect you from the very thing it is taking from you. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. It was late afternoon when Claire arrived. I heard her car before I saw it. The smooth engine hum of something expensive. She always parked perfectly, like even her arrival needed to look composed. She didn't knock. She never did. She walked in with a smile already formed, the kind of smile that appears before emotion, not because of it. "Dad," she said, voice bright. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. She had never been in the area, a day in her life without scheduling it 2 weeks ahead. I didn't correct her. She walked through the house as if assessing the lighting, the space, the surfaces, noticing what could be changed, what could be sold, what could be converted into a different life, one that wouldn't include me in the same way. Her perfume lingered lightly in the air, floral, expensive, calculated. She sat across from me at the dining table, crossing her legs carefully, her posture perfect. "You look good," she said. "Stronger. That's wonderful." Her tone was soft, but her eyes were sharp. She wasn't here to check on my health. She waited for a moment of silence before continuing. "So, I talked to Daniel. We really think the sooner we get things organized, the better. Less stress for you, less confusion later. It'll just make everything easier. Easier. Always easier. Convenience disguised as compassion." I didn't respond immediately. Silence has power when you allow it. Claire took that silence as permission to continue. She reached into her handbag, polished leather, structured, and pulled out a crisp folder. She opened it slowly, deliberately, placing a single sheet of paper on the table between us. It was a power of attorney form, unfilled, except for the section where my signature would go. Daniel had already signed as the alternate decision-maker. She spoke lightly, as though we were discussing grocery lists. "This just allows us to manage things if something happens. You won't have to worry about bills or property or medical decisions. We'll handle everything. You'll be taken care of." Taken care of. My wife used to use that phrase too. But hers meant held, supported, cherished. Claire's version meant overridden, redirected, minimized. I lifted the paper. The weight wasn't in the sheet. It was in the assumption. Claire folded her hands. "We're just trying to help. We want to do the right thing. And honestly," her tone softened, rehearsed, "things have felt a little unclear lately, with Emily being around so much." There it was. The reason she had really come. Not care. Not planning. Not concern. Territory. I set the paper down. "Emily is here," I said calmly. "Because she chooses to be." Claire blinked. Just once. Her smile didn't change, but something in her eyes tightened. "We know she means well," she said. "But she's emotional, attached. And things involving the estate require clarity, objectivity. We can't have confusion about decision-making. Confusion." That word sat in my chest. I had been many things in my life. Unsure, grieving, tired, but I had never been confused. I looked at my daughter. Really looked. She was beautiful, poised, articulate. She had my wife's cheekbones, but none of her softness, none of her stillness, none of her warmth. Claire mistook composure for love. She mistook management for care. She mistook inheritance as destiny. "I'm not signing this," I said. The air changed. Not the temperature, the atmosphere. Claire didn't frown. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. Her training had been too thorough for that. But her expression sharpened in the smallest way, like the subtle shift of a blade's angle. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes." She sat for a long moment. Then she gathered the paper, slid it neatly back into the folder, and placed it in her bag. Her voice was calm again, smooth as glass. "We'll talk more later," she said. "When things are clearer." She stood, kissed my cheek lightly, barely, touching me, and left. The door closed behind her. The silence that followed was absolute, not empty, revealing. Sat there for a long time, not hurt, not angry, just awake. Some truths don't require dramatic realization. They simply stand in front of you and wait to be acknowledged. My daughter loved the idea of me, not the reality of me, and love. Real love is found in presence, not paperwork. This was the moment I understood the decision I would have to make. Not to punish, not to correct, but to reflect the truth of what had already been lived. There are decisions we think will feel dramatic when we make them. But the real turning points in life often happen quietly, in rooms that look ordinary, with nothing more than steady hands and still breath. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The morning I finalized the addendum was calm. Too calm, maybe. The house felt held in place by a kind of gentle stillness, the kind that comes before a storm, but also before clarity. I moved slowly, not because of weakness, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to do. Emily knocked softly before letting herself in. She carried a small bag of groceries, bread, jam, tea, nothing extravagant, just enough to keep comfort present in the room. She didn't know why I had asked her to come with me that day. I hadn't explained. She didn't ask. We drove to Mr. Price's office in silence. Not heavy silence, just presence. The trees outside blurred past in soft autumn shades. The air smelled faintly of rain. Emily kept her eyes on the road, hands relaxed on the wheel. She always drove like someone who believed in arriving, not rushing. When we stepped inside the law office, the dim lighting met us like an old memory. The carpet quieted footsteps. The walls were lined with framed degrees and photographs of legal conferences no one remembers attending. The front desk woman greeted me by name, a small acknowledgement that felt steadier than I expected. Mr. Price ushered us into a private conference room. He didn't ask questions. He didn't repeat what we had discussed before. He simply placed a stack of documents in front of me and set a fountain pen beside them. The pen was weighty, brass, polished, meant for signatures that change things. "Read it once more," he murmured. So I did. The addendum was not poetic. It didn't need to be. It was plain, clear, and unembellished. The truth always is. I acknowledged Emily's care, not as charity, not as obligation, but as presence. I acknowledged my children's distance, not as malice, not as cruelty, but as choice. I stated in my own handwriting that love is measured by who stays. And then came the line that changed everything. The primary beneficiary of my estate is to be Emily Carter. My children would receive mementos, objects with meaning, not punishment, just reflection. What was in the heart returned to the heart. I breathed in deeply. Then I signed. My signature glided onto the page, steady and calm. Michael Harris, date, Mr. Price, added his witness signature. His assistant added hers. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with a metal-pressed legal closure. Once sealed, the contents could not be changed without repeating the entire process. No theatrics, no ceremony, just a soft click as the seal pressed shut. Emily sat across from me. She still didn't know. She wouldn't know until I was gone. That is how the addendum works. Mr. Price placed the envelope into a locked, polished steel drawer built into the wall. I heard the soft slide of metal against metal as it went inside. Then the latch. Then the lock. That was the sound of a lifetime shifting direction. Not loudly, not painfully. Just, finally, we walked back to the car quietly. The sky outside had begun to cloud, but not in a threatening way. More like it was preparing to rain gently, the kind of rain that feels like exhaling. I sat in the passenger seat while Emily started the engine. She looked at me, her expression soft, steady. "You seem lighter," she said. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to feel the truth before I spoke it. "I think I stopped waiting," I finally said. "For what?" she asked. "For the version of my children I kept hoping would return." She didn't speak. She simply nodded, understanding without prying, and started driving. The tires hummed softly against the road. Houses and trees passed by in muted color. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was being carried forward by life. I felt like I was steering again. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of recognition. Love had already chosen itself, had simply put it on paper. When people sense distance, they react. Some reach closer, some step back, and some try to perform the closeness they think is expected of them. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. It happened slowly at first. A gradual shift, a softening of tone that didn't feel real. My phone began ringing more often, not with urgency, not with concern, but with something practiced. Familiar words delivered with unfamiliar timing. "Claire, good morning. Thinking of you today." She had never used a heart emoji with me before. "Daniel, how's the garden looking? Need help with anything this weekend?" He hadn't asked about the garden in years. This wasn't warmth. This was damage control. The kind a person attempts when they sense something changing, even if they can't yet name what. I didn't bring up the addendum. I didn't hint at it. I let their actions speak for themselves. Emily continued visiting, but she didn't change anything about how she behaved. She didn't become more attentive or careful or affectionate, because she had always been those things. Her kindness wasn't a strategy. It was her nature. One afternoon, she brought homemade stew. Rich, warm, seasoned the way my wife used to make it. We were just sitting down to eat when my phone rang. Daniel. Calling this time, not texting. I answered, and his voice was bright. Too bright. "Hey, Dad! Just thought I'd stop by later. Maybe we could have dinner together? Just the two of us." The timing was perfect. Too perfect. "Oh," I said gently. "Emily already made dinner. You're welcome to join." A small pause. Not long, but enough to reveal discomfort. "Oh, Emily's there." "Yes." His tone pulled back, like someone stepping away from something hot. "Maybe another time," he said. I thanked him for calling. He didn't ask how I was before hanging up. Emily didn't comment. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't smile, didn't sigh. She simply continued ladling stew into bowls. She understood restraint. She understood dignity. She understood that not all truths need to be spoken aloud. We ate quietly, the light from the kitchen window falling across the table in long evening shapes. The stew tasted like memory, like home, like something lived, not expected. Later that week, Claire arrived. Not unexpectedly. She sent a message first. "Claire, thinking of coming by today. Would love to spend time." The smiley face was wrong. It sat there like a sticker covering something cracked. When she arrived, she came with flowers, store-bought, arranged, pretty, perfect. They looked like a gift for an event. not a person. She placed them in a vase without asking where anything was. She already knew. She had lived in this house once, back before she began living outside of anything that required depth. She walked through the rooms again. Her eyes lingered a little longer this time, on the piano, on the framed photographs, on the hallway closet, where old winter coats stayed soft with time. She was taking inventory, not of belongings, of loss risk. She sat with me on the couch, crossed her legs, and asked about my health with the tone of someone reading from a script. And then she said it. "Dad, I really hope you know we love you, me and Daniel. We always have. You know that, right?" My breathing remained steady. I had learned not to rush truth. "I know you love what we once were," I said. "But love is shown, not said." She didn't respond, not with words. Her smile stayed, but it hollowed slightly. And that was the first honest thing in the room. After she left, I pulled out my journal. I wrote only one line. When love needs to be performed, it isn't love. It's fear. The calls and visits continued through the following days. But now, everything was slightly exaggerated. Longer hugs, softer voices, thoughtful pauses, all placed carefully, deliberately, like furniture arranged for guests. But no one asked what I needed. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked who I had become, except Emily. She didn't ask because she already knew. The truth was no longer forming. It was formed. My children weren't returning to me. They were returning to what they feared. Losing, and fear is not love. Not now. Not ever. I've learned that endings rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with thunder or declarations. They show up as calendar reminders, quiet confirmations, and a date circled in ink. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. It was a Wednesday morning when the call came from Mr. Price's office. The receptionist's voice was soft and practiced, as though she had said these words 1,000 times to 1,000 families. "Mr. Harris, we're ready to finalize the estate documents. The meeting will include all named beneficiaries. Would you like us to schedule a reading?" There it was, not dramatic, just inevitable. I told her yes. She offered 2 dates. I chose one without hesitation. My voice sounded calm even to my own ears. Too calm, maybe. When I hung up, the house was quiet. I looked around the room. Not with sadness, but with recognition. This wasn't about property. It wasn't about money. It was about the truth finally being spoken in a room where no one could talk over it. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the garden. The oak tree stood tall, bare of leaves now. It was late autumn, yet still rooted, steady, patient. It had survived storms, seasons, winters. It didn't need to bloom to prove it was alive. I found myself breathing with it. Later that afternoon, I called Daniel and Claire. Daniel answered quickly, too quickly. His voice was light, almost relieved. "Dad, good timing. Claire and I were just talking about you." Of course they were. "We'll have the final estate meeting soon," I said. "Mr. Price will go over everything. I want both of you there." Daniel exhaled in what sounded like triumph. "Finally. Good. We're glad you're taking this seriously. This will be fair for everyone." Fair? The word meant different things to different people. Claire joined the call halfway through. Her voice smooth, familiar in its confidence. "We'll be there, Dad. Of course. We just want everything to be straightforward. Straightforward. Predictable. In their favor." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't correct. I simply said, "The appointment confirmation will be emailed to you." There was a brief pause, the smallest flicker of doubt in the silence. And then assurance flooded back into their voices. They believed they already knew the outcome. Believed they were walking into a room, designed for them. Emily came by that evening. She found me at the kitchen table, tea gone cold, hands folded loosely in front of me. "How was your day?" she asked. The question felt like walking into warm light. Not the polite question people ask to get to their own turn to speak. The real question. The one that means, I am here with you, not around you. I told her about the scheduled meeting. She didn't flinch. She didn't tense. But a quietness settled in her eyes, a knowing kind of stillness. "Do you feel okay about it?" she asked. "I do," I said. It was the truth. Not proud, not triumphant, just at peace. She sat down across from me. No lecture, no advice, just presence. She reached for my hand. A small gesture, but grounding. "You've already made your decisions," she said softly. "The meeting just makes them visible." Visible. Yes, that was the word. The next morning, an appointment confirmation email arrived. Subject: Estate Review and Finalization. Date: November 14th, 10:22. AM location: Price and Associates office. Conference room A attached was a PDF. The official scheduling. Receipt: I printed it, folded it. Once, placed it in the top drawer of my desk. Not as a reminder, as a marker. A line had been drawn. The days leading up to the meeting passed quietly. Daniel sent check-in calls. Claire sent pictures of possible senior living condos she thought looked cozy. Their words were softer than ever. Soft in the way a blade can be wrapped in silk. Emily continued to show up exactly as she always had. No shift, no adjustment. Because real love does not react to circumstance. It remains. The night before the meeting, I stood at the window, looking at the dark outline of the oak tree against the sky. The wind moved through its branches, bare, unadorned, unafraid. Something in me mirrored it. I was ready, not to confront, not to defend, to reveal. Because tomorrow, the truth would not be argued. It would simply be read aloud, and there is no undoing what is written. There are rooms that hold history, and then there are rooms that hold truth. Mr. Price's conference room was one of the latter. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The morning of the estate meeting was cool, gray, quiet. The kind of morning where sound feels softer. I woke before my alarm, not from worry, but because my mind was already awake. Steady, clear. I dressed slowly, buttoning my shirt with deliberate care, like each button was a decision I had already made peace with. Emily offered to drive me. I told her yes. The road to the law office passed through familiar streets. The cafe where I used to take my wife on Sunday mornings. The bookstore where Emily once picked out the perfect gift with no guidance at all. The world outside the window looked unchanged, but I was not the person I had been when I last drove these same roads. We arrived 5 minutes early. I like being early. It gives the world a chance to settle before things happen. Daniel and Claire arrived together. Daniel wore a suit. Sharp. Confident. The easy kind of suit a man wears when he believes his future is already written in bold, generous strokes. Claire wore soft colors, her version of sincerity. They both hugged me, light, brief, barely there. Their smiles were polite and tense, like they were already anticipating a victory they didn't want to appear too eager about. They greeted Emily too, but the greeting was thinner, like a handshake made of air. Mr. Price ushered us into the room. The conference table was solid oak, polished, heavy. A single folder sat at the center, closed, waiting. There were no dramatics, no dimmed lights, no tension music, just paper, chairs, and the sound of quiet breathing. We all sat. I watched their faces, not out of spite, not to analyze, but simply because I wanted to remember them exactly as they were in this moment. Expectant. Sure. Unaware. Mr. Price cleared his throat. A small, practiced sound. Today, we are reviewing the final will and testament of Michael Harris, he said. At his request, all named parties are present. No one spoke. Daniel leaned back slightly, shoulders relaxed. Claire folded her hands neatly in her lap. Emily looked down, steady, humble, not expecting to be part of anything beyond support. Mr. Price opened the folder. The sound of paper sliding free was soft, unremarkable. But my heart recognized it for what it was. A curtain rising. He began reading. It was the standard will first. The version my children believed was the entire will. To my children, Daniel Harris and Claire Harris, I leave the following personal items. He listed heirlooms, watches, jewelry, photographs, piano sheet music annotated in my wife's handwriting, items with memory, meaning, history, but not monetary value. Daniel and Claire nodded politely, perhaps a little too politely, because these were the sentimental preludes, the things one must get through before the real matter. Assets. I watched their eyes, not their hands, not their expressions. Their eyes. Eyes reveal truth before the tongue does, Mr. Price continued. Regarding real estate holdings, savings accounts, investment funds, and remaining assets, Daniel leaned forward, Claire's chin lifted. Emily remained still. The main will document was placed flat on the table. Crisp, unfolded, final, Mr. Price read the next line. At this time, the estate includes the residence at 214 Brookside Lane, total savings and investment balances, and all personal property not otherwise designated. Daniel's eyes gleamed. Claire smiled in a quiet, victorious way. They believed the moment had arrived. They believed they had already won. There was nothing cruel in my stillness, just clarity. Mr. Price finished reading the standard will structure. Equal division, just as expected. But he did not close the folder. He placed his hand. Instead, on the sealed envelope beside it, Daniel noticed. I met his gaze. I didn't throw you away, I said. You stepped back. I just finally stopped pretending you didn't. He shook his head. Not in disagreement, but in disbelief. We had careers, responsibilities, families. Life didn't stop just because you were sick. I know, I said. That's what I realized. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. There is a difference. Claire finally spoke, her voice soft, uneven. We didn't know you needed us. I nodded. That's the point. You didn't ask. You didn't look. You assumed I'd always be there, waiting, available, understandable. I let the words breathe before continuing. Emily didn't have to know. She paid attention. Emily closed her eyes, not out of pride, but out of aching. She whispered, I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I know, I said. If you were, none of this would have happened. Because love that wants reward isn't love. Daniel's voice cracked, truly cracked, for the first time. So, what are we to you now? And there it was. Not anger, not manipulation, fear. The fear of realizing that love cannot be taken for granted. I took a slow breath. You are my children, I said. Always. I don't stop loving you because I choose someone else to inherit the life I built. But inheritance is not a summary of love. It is a reflection of presence. Claire let out a small sound, part laugh, part sob. It feels like punishment. It isn't, I said. Punishment is for wrongdoing. This is acknowledgement of what was given, of what was not. She looked at Emily, really looked, and the sharpness finally disappeared. not replaced by warmth, not acceptance, just clarity. Emily opened her mouth as if to speak, but I shook my head gently. She didn't need to. This wasn't her weight to carry. Reached into my coat and placed my journal on the table. The pages filled with dates, arrival times, departure times, who stayed, who didn't. No accusations, no emotion, just record. The truth, documented quietly. Daniel looked at the journal like it was a verdict. "We didn't know you were keeping score," he whispered. "I wasn't," I said. I was remembering. Silence, again. But this time, it was different, because denial was gone. This was recognition. Daniel sat down slowly. Claire wiped her face without hiding it. Emily's breathing steadied. No one apologized. Not yet. Apologies require understanding. We had only just arrived at truth. The confrontation didn't end with resolution, or forgiveness, or peace. It ended with honesty, and honesty is the beginning of everything that comes after. Healing or distance. We stood up. One. Not together, not apart. There is a particular stillness that happens right after truth is spoken, not relief, not resolution, just the quiet of a room that no longer has anything left to hide. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. When the meeting ended, no one got up right away. We remained seated. Not because we didn't know how to leave, but because we were no longer the same people who had entered. Daniel was the first to move. He stood slowly, like someone rising from deep water, unsure of which direction led to air. He didn't look at Emily. He didn't look at the documents. He looked at me. There was no anger there anymore, just something hollow, something frightened, something that had the shape of a son realizing he was not the center of his father's world. "We'll talk," he said, but his voice lacked force. It sounded like the echo of a man who wasn't sure who he was speaking to, or what he was promising. He walked toward the door. Claire rose more carefully. She took a moment to smooth her hair, wipe the last traces of tears from her face, and gather her composure like a coat she needed to put back on before stepping outside. She turned toward me and tried to speak. The first attempt didn't form words. The second attempt did. Barely. "I didn't know," she whispered. It was the closest she had ever come to apology. I nodded, not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, just in acknowledgement. Understanding does not erase history, but it can begin to reshape it. Claire followed her brother out without looking back. The door clicked shut. For a moment, the room felt startlingly quiet, like a theater after the final line, just before the audience decides whether to clap or to remain frozen in what they've witnessed. Emily and I did not speak. We didn't need to. We simply sat, letting the air settle. I could hear faint movements in the hallway, footsteps, doors closing, the controlled rhythm of people trying to hold themselves together in public. The kind of leaving that isn't just physical, because they hadn't just walked out of the office. They had walked out of the version of family they believed was guaranteed. Emily finally stood. She moved slowly, protectively, as though touching the moment might disturb it. "Do you want to go home?" she asked. Her voice was soft. Not fragile, just real. I nodded. We left the office, passing the reception desk, the framed photos, the untouched magazines on waiting tables. Everything outside the conference room was unchanged. The world did not pause to acknowledge what had just happened. But I had changed, and they had too. The parking lot was quiet. A cool breeze moved through the early afternoon, stirring leaves across the pavement. Emily opened the car door for me, not out of obligation, but out of care that had never once needed explaining. As she drove, I watched the town pass by in fragments. The bakery where my wife once laughed so loudly. The baker joined her. The old movie theater where Daniel saw his first film. The sidewalk where Claire had tripped and scraped her knee and cried until I carried her. Home. Places remember us even when people forget. Emily didn't speak. She allowed the silence to take its shape without trying to fill it. The steady hum of the engine, the faint sound of wind through the cracked window. It all felt strangely grounding. When we reached the house, I paused for a moment before getting out. The air smelled of earth and distant rain. A feeling of finality, not loss, moved through me. Inside, the house felt different, not larger, not smaller, just honest. Everything that had been hidden behind obligation, expectation, tradition, it had all been stripped away. Emily placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. "You don't have to pretend today," she said. I didn't realize until then how long I had been pretending. Pretending not to hurt, pretending not to see, pretending not to need. I nodded and sat down at the kitchen table. Emily brewed tea, the same way my wife used to. Quiet motions, familiar sounds, a ritual older than grief. We didn't talk about the meeting. We didn't analyze. We didn't justify. We just existed, side by side, in the aftermath of truth. And the house, for the first time in a long time, felt lived in. Not by history, by presence. When we returned home, it didn't feel like a place waiting anymore. It felt like a place present, alive, honest. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The key turned in the lock with the familiar click, and the door opened to the same hallway, the same framed photographs, the same soft light falling across the wooden floor. But I was different now. And when we change, the places we return to do too, even if nothing in them has moved. Emily stepped inside first, her bag still over her shoulder. She didn't switch on every light like my children did. She didn't try to fill the room. She simply walked quietly toward the kitchen and began the soft rituals of being here. Setting the kettle on, pulling 2 cups from the cabinet, moving in a way that felt gentle, steady, certain. I followed slowly, taking in the rooms one by one. The living room, the photographs, the piano untouched but not forgotten, the dining table where so many meals had been shared, so many silences endured. Nothing had changed, except the meaning of everything. I sat down at the kitchen table. The chair felt familiar beneath me. Emily set a cup of tea in front of me and sat across from me, her posture relaxed, her eyes soft. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't ask what I was thinking. She didn't ask if I regretted anything. She simply sat. Presence, again. Steady, unrewarded. Unasked for, real. We stayed like that for a long time, in the kind of silence that restores rather than empties. Eventually, I spoke. I thought today would feel heavier. Emily didn't interrupt. I thought I'd feel guilt or grief or something sharp, but I don't. I only feel. I paused, searching for the right word. Clear. Emily nodded. A small smile, barely there. Clarity can feel peaceful, she said. Even when it hurts. It does hurt, I said. But it's the kind that tells the truth. She folded her hands around her cup. I know, she whispered. There was no triumph in her voice, no sense of winning, no satisfaction. All she felt was the weight of being chosen. A weight she never sought. After the tea cooled, we went outside. But I will tell you what I've learned from experience. Inheritance does not create conflict. It only reveals it. At the time, The meaning didn't land. I thought my children cared for me. Genuinely. Deeply. I believed time and shared memories were stronger than resentment or self-interest. I believed we were bound by something unbreakable. So I nodded, and we drafted the will. Property divided evenly. Account balances split. Personal belongings allocated thoughtfully. Nothing dramatic. Nothing heavy. When I left that day, the sun was bright outside. I remember feeling content, certain I had acted wisely. Emily drove me home, though I was perfectly capable of driving myself. She didn't insist. She simply offered. And I accepted because her presence was comforting in a way I didn't have words for then. On the drive back, the radio played softly. Emily didn't speak much. She rarely did unless there was something worth saying. I've always admired that about her. Half the world fills silence because they fear it. She let silence breathe. As we pulled into the driveway, she asked, "Are you sure they'll understand this? The decisions you're making?" I smiled, a bit amused. "There's nothing to understand," I said. "It's equal. No one can be upset about fairness." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. There was a sadness in her eyes. Not disagreement, but awareness. She had seen parts of my family I had chosen not to see. A week later, Claire called, not to ask how I was, not to reminisce or check on me. No, she wanted to know about the contents of the appointment. How did it go? What did you decide? Are things straightforward? Her voice was light, friendly, but the tone underneath was sharp. Careful. Daniel asked too, though his approach was different. "So, Dad, did you make sure everything is legally tight? You know how complications can happen." Complications meaning, make sure nothing prevents me from getting what I expect. I ignored the undertones. I told myself I was imagining things. Because love does that. It bends uncomfortable truths until they stop hurting. The Ver. A week after drafting the will, a courier delivered the unsigned copy to my home. Cream-colored envelope. Thick paper, ink that smelled faintly of permanence. I set it on the dining table, intending to sign it the next morning. But when I sat down to do so, my hand hesitated. Not because I doubted the fairness, but because there was a quiet tug in my chest, a whisper. Wait. Watch a little longer. I placed the will in a folder and slid it into the desk drawer. I told myself it was temporary, but something had already begun shifting. Not in the world around me, not in my children's behavior that had been shifting for years. I just hadn't seen it. What changed was my willingness to see. In the weeks that followed, I started paying attention to tone, to timing, to what was said and what was never said. Fairness, I realized, was not always just and love. Love was not always love. I didn't sign the will. Not yet, because some truths reveal themselves only when we stop looking away. I thought drafting my will would be a formality, a responsible thing to do. I assumed it would be quick, clean, uncomplicated. But the moment I sat down in that leather chair across from my attorney, something in the air felt heavier than I expected. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick volumes no one reads unless they have to. A single window let in muted daylight, the kind that looks tired. Mr. Alden Price sat behind his desk, hands folded, expression unreadable in the way only seasoned attorneys manage. I had known him for years. He helped with small matters, property titles, insurance filings, but this was different. This was legacy. He began with the tone professionals use when they are trained to remove emotion from sentences. "We'll start with the basics," he said. "Assets, property, distribution preferences." I nodded. I already had an answer. An easy one. Everything split evenly between Daniel and Claire, I said. 50-50. He didn't write it down. He just studied me for a moment, not unkindly, but with awareness. I didn't understand then what he was quietly assessing. I do now. That's standard, he finally said. And simple. But I need to ask, is that what you want? Or is that what feels correct on paper? I almost laughed. What's the difference? Mr. Price leaned back in his chair slightly, fingers resting on the corner of a yellow legal pad. Inheritance doesn't create conflict, he said. It reveals it. The words sat in the room like a weight. I didn't know what to do with them at the time. I had always believed I raised my children well, with care, stability, opportunity. We shared holidays, vacations, birthdays. Yes, there had been distance in recent years, but I attributed that to adulthood. Busy schedules, life moving quickly, so I smiled. Not defensive, just certain. Yes, I said. Equal is right. Equal is fair. He didn't argue. He just wrote it down, neat and clean. We spent the next hour reviewing accounts, home valuation, retirement savings, personal effects, photographs, heirlooms, things that held memory value more than monetary worth. The conversation was methodical, professional, no sentiment, no storytelling, just numbers and instructions. But somewhere in the middle of the meeting, something flickered in my mind. A moment in the hospital. Emily's hand resting over mine, her voice, her quiet loyalty, her presence. And then, just as quickly, the image faded beneath the habit of old beliefs. My children love me. They will be grateful. They will honor this. When I left the office, the day was bright, almost too bright. The kind of day that makes you squint, even when the sky is clear. I felt good, accomplished, responsible. I believed I had secured peace. Emily drove me home, not because I needed help, but because she didn't like the thought of me sitting in a waiting room alone. She didn't ask what was in the will. She didn't even bring it up. She just asked, "Do you want to stop for tea before we go back?" We sat at a small cafe near the park. The windows were open. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and something sweet, like fresh pastry. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There are some people whose presence is enough. But there was a moment, small, barely noticeable, when I caught her watching me with a look I couldn't identify then. Not expectation, not curiosity. Something softer, something like concern. "Everything okay?" she asked. I nodded. I thought so. The next morning, a courier delivered the draft will in a sealed envelope. Heavy paper, embossed letterhead, sharp black ink. I sat at the dining table alone, unfolded it carefully, smoothed the pages with my palm. My signature line was empty. I picked up the pen, and my hand stopped. Not shaking, not uncertain, just paused. For the first time, I wondered if equal was the same as fair. That was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for. Yet, a shifting, a quiet one. The kind that starts like a whisper in a locked room. I placed the unsigned will in the desk drawer, not because I changed my mind, but because something inside me had finally begun to open its eyes. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, subtle, quiet, sometimes invisible to everyone but you. I learned that after my wife passed, and I learned it again in the months that followed. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from or what time it is. There is a small garden behind my house. Nothing extravagant, just a patch of rose bushes, a few lavender shrubs, and the oak tree my wife planted the year Daniel was born. She used to spend mornings out there, pruning, watering, humming softly under her breath. Even when illness had stolen most of her strength, she insisted on tending to it. "Living things need to be reminded they're wanted," she'd say. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to step outside for weeks. The garden felt like a room she hadn't finished leaving yet. Every petal, every leaf looked like a memory I wasn't ready to face. But Emily gently changed that. One afternoon, months after the surgery, she suggested we take a walk. Nothing forced, nothing heavy. Just air, just movement. She waited until I nodded before leading me outside, patient, unhurried. The sunlight felt softer than I remembered. The breeze carried a faint, sweet scent of rosemary. The birds were loud enough to fill the silence without demanding anything from me. We sat on the old wooden bench by the oak tree. Its paint was chipped, the wood worn smooth by time and hands and weather. I traced one of the grooves in the armrest with my thumb, remembering how my wife used to lean her head on my shoulder right here. During evenings when the world felt simple. "I miss her too," Emily said, so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. I looked at her. Really looked. Her eyes weren't red. She wasn't crying. But her voice held that heaviness of someone who has been holding grief in the same room, just from a different angle. I realized then that she hadn't just been helping me survive the loss. She had been grieving beside me. My children never talked about their mother anymore. They sent flowers on holidays. They posted photos on anniversaries. But grief, to them, was something to acknowledge and quickly move past. Efficiency disguised as strength. Emily treated grief like a room with a door that stays open. We talked for a while. Not about deep things. Not yet. Just comfortable small memories. The way my wife used to tuck her hair behind her ear. The way she laughed without covering her mouth. The way she knew the exact moment someone needed silence instead of words. At some point, Emily stood and walked to the garden bed. She knelt and began trimming the dead stems from the roses with a small pair of shears she had brought from her apartment. The garden waited, quiet, bare, patient. The last leaves of autumn had fallen. Branches and stems reached upward like memory. The air was cool enough to sting lightly when inhaled. I walked slowly to the oak tree. The one my wife planted all those years ago. Emily didn't follow closely. She gave me a few steps of space. The kind of space that still feels accompanied. I placed my hand on the trunk. The bark was rough, familiar, years layered on years, growth hidden in seasons unseen. I could still remember the day we planted it. My wife wore a white cotton dress, and her hair was pinned loosely at the back of her neck. She laughed when the soil caught under her nails. She said the tree would outlive us, and that made her happy. I kept thinking, I said quietly, still looking at the branches, that my children would remember her the way I did. Emily's voice reached me softly. Steady as always. "They remember her," she said. "Just not the parts you hoped they would." The wind moved through the garden, slow, cool, gentle. I nodded. They remember the summers, the parties, the celebrations, the best parts, but they don't remember the late nights, the cold winters, the sickness, the grief, the parts where love is work. Emily stepped closer and stood beside me, not touching, not intruding. "That's because you were the one who stayed for those parts," she said. I closed my eyes, and I let that truth settle. We walked back inside, and I took the small handwritten note from my bedside drawer, the one that read, "You're not alone." I placed it into a simple frame. Not ornate, not expensive, just enough to keep it safe. I set it on the mantel. Visible. Present, known. That night, I didn't think of the meeting or Daniel's voice or the scrape of a chair across the floor or Claire's trembling hands. I thought of the garden, the oak tree, the note, the quiet presence of someone who stayed. The house didn't feel empty. It felt full, with something real. People imagine endings as moments of noise, final speeches, raised voices, grand gestures. But most endings don't sound like that. They sound like a house settling, a kettle cooling, a page being closed. If you're watching this, Tell me where you're from, or what time it is. The days after the meeting passed without dramatic phone calls. No confrontations, no accusations, just silence. The kind that follows an emotional storm, where every person retreats into their own thoughts to understand what just happened. Daniel didn't call. Claire didn't text, not out of anger, but because the foundation they had always trusted was no longer unspoken. It was written, signed, legal, real, and they needed time to face the truth of themselves. I didn't rush them. Some distances are meant to teach, not punish. Meanwhile, life continued in small, steady rhythms. Emily came by one morning with fresh bread from the market, still warm from the oven. The house smelled like comfort again. She didn't hover. She didn't reassure. She simply existed alongside me, the way someone does when love no longer needs to be spoken aloud. We sat on the porch, wrapped in sweaters against the late autumn air. The oak tree stood bare, dark branches reaching against the gray sky. Even leafless, it was alive. "Winter's coming," I said. "It always does," Emily answered softly. "But the tree stays," I said. She nodded, understanding the meaning without needing explanation. "Not everything that looks still is lifeless. Not everything that looks quiet is empty." Grief had turned into memory. Memory had turned into steadiness. That was enough. Later that afternoon, I returned to my journal, the one that had begun simply as record, and became something else entirely. I wrote slowly, not documenting dates or times now. Just truth. You cannot lose what was never present. You cannot keep what does not stay, but what stays, stays without. Being asked, I closed the journal. I didn't need it anymore. I see. Doorbell rang the next morning. A soft ring, hesitant. When I opened the door, Claire stood there. Her eyes were swollen, not from crying now, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes from thinking about yourself honestly for the first time in a long time. She didn't step inside immediately. "Can I come in?" she asked. I nodded. She sat in the living room, not perched, not poised, but present. For the first time in years, she didn't perform. She just sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap. "I was angry," she said. "I know," I responded. "I thought you didn't love us anymore." I shook my head. "Gentle, slow. I've never stopped loving you," I said. "But I stopped pretending love and presence were the same thing." She wiped her cheek. But the tears didn't feel like heartbreak now. They felt like truth. "I don't know how to fix everything," she whispered. "You don't have to fix everything," I said. "Just show up. When it matters. When it's real. When it's quiet." She nodded, and we sat together, just like Emily and I had, letting silence do the work that words never could. She didn't stay long, but when she hugged me before leaving, she held on longer than she used to. It was a beginning, not a return. Beginnings don't need guarantees. Daniel did not come right away, but healing has different tempos for different hearts, and I had stopped measuring love by speed. What mattered was this: the house was no longer a waiting room. It was a home again. Not because it was full of people, but because it was full of truth. I placed the framed note, "You're not alone," on the mantel, beside a photograph of my wife smiling in the garden. Two gestures of love, one from memory, one from presence, both real. I sit here now, telling this story to you, not to justify my choices, but to leave you with this. Family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by who stays when staying is hard. Love is not what we say. It is what we repeat. And peace the kind that lasts, is built on truth spoken gently, but spoken fully. My life did not end with loss. It continued with clarity, and clarity, I have learned, is a kind of love. End of story.